Nigel mentioned, I'm very conscious that I stand between you and food, so I will try to keep it brief. My name is Kate Timmons. I work in the School of Sport and Exercise Science, lecturing in physical activity and health and nutrition. And I was going to present today some of the work that came from an ESRC-funded network, where we met with colleagues at lots of different institutions to talk about new forms of data, so new sources of data that we potentially could be using for academic research. So before we get started though, I'd like to just wake you all from your sitting down, basically. Could you, if you've got internet-enabled devices, if you could log on to the Poll Everywhere poll here, and I'm going to play a little word association game. So what I want you to do once you've logged on is you'll be asked, what's the first word you think of when you hear or have read the words big data? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Give you a minute to log on. I can see people doing it, so I can see you've actually got the internet, which is promising. Yeah. Lovely. Thank you. Okay, so, and it is as I suspected. Lots of numbers. Some people literally just thought of the word big, so I don't know what that says about them. But you can see there we've got words like complexity, statistics, machines, spreadsheets. There's a few negative words coming in there. So we've got mystification, scary. I'm trying to think what else we've got there. Bureaucracy, paper. So actually, some negative words, also some more positive words. And the reason I asked you to do that is because, as I expected, some of those negative words, when you talk about big data, lots of people might start to think about big tobacco, big pharma, big sugar. The big connotation is often linked to industrial sort of sinister motives to do with global profit-making incentives. So the question is big data the same? If you ask the question, some people might say yes. Actually, what I want to argue is that these companies themselves aren't necessarily just using harvesting our data for sinister purposes. Even now, there are serious academics working behind the scenes, for example, at Facebook, analysing data that they could have only dreamed about a few decades ago. So actually, are these forms of data an opportunity rather than a threat? So I'm actually a nutritional epidemiologist and physical activity epidemiologist by background. So how did I start talking about big data? Well, nutrition is a notoriously challenging field to work in. In the last 100 years or so, we're still essentially using the same forms of data collection, which is simply asking someone, what did you eat? Or what have you eaten? Getting them to record it. There are issues with that in terms of boredom, so people don't always write down what they've eaten, but also, intentionally or otherwise, they don't always accurately report back what they have eaten. With that in mind, Public Health England actually commissioned a review a few years back when I was working at Leeds, which wanted to look at the new forms of data collection for dietary assessment that could be used in our national diet surveys. So we were going to review emerging technologies. There were some interesting things we found during this literature review. So some inventive, a bit sci-fi ideas. I'm not sure these are going to take off that well with research participants who are that keen to wear a throat band for a few weeks. So it was a little bit disappointing, I think. We didn't find any golden bullets that would solve our problems with all this new technology to measure dietary assessment. On the back of that, I was invited to join this network, which is funded by the ESRC. And the remit really was to bring together lots of different researchers as well as other stakeholders to talk about ways that we could use different newer sources of data to try and answer questions relating to obesity. Obesity, in particular, the media are fond to tell you we have an epidemic. What the media are less inclined to tell you is that it's not just about individual behaviours. This is a causal map that the Foresight team drew up a few years ago. And although you can't see it on this slide, basically each of those nodes shows the different areas that can affect energy balance within an individual. So you see, as well as individual activity, there's all sorts to do with food production and societal influences. So as well as this problem we have with assessing actually what people consume in their diet, maybe we also want to be harnessing new forms of data to look at these other areas, these other influences that might affect obesity. So the first thing that the network was charged with was trying to define what we meant for big data, what were we actually talking about. And I won't go into this in too much detail because there are still arguments even within the network about what we agree this to mean. But essentially we've agreed that it's usually digital, it's usually large in scope, and has volume, what we call the 3 V's, volume, variety, or velocity. So we're talking about large-scale things, essentially large in sample size, large in time, or large, speedy in the immediacy that we get the data back. And the first thing that the paper that I led on that came out from this network was a review of how these new forms of data have been used so far in obesity research. Specifically in this review, we were looking at what we call repurposed data. So it's data that's been collected not for research purposes, but has then been sort of commandeered to see if we could answer research questions using it. I'm not going to be able to present you, you'll be relieved to know, all of the papers that we found in that review, especially because we do want to get some lunch. But I'll just cherry pick, shamefully, some to illustrate the kinds of papers that we found. How many of you have used an app like MapMyFitness or MapMyRun, for example? Can I see a show of hands? MyFitnessPal? Quite a few, I'd say that's more than half. MapMyFitness is actually an app where you can track your activities, so you can plan routes or you can use the GPS to measure where you've run, and it will give you information back on the distance that you've gone and the pace, for example. This study collected data. How many of you have actually read the terms and conditions if you use one of these before you accepted them? No hands whatsoever. So you probably should, because it will tell you what your data is going to be used for. This study used data in California in 2016 to look at the routes that people did. And it was all descriptive. They just had a look to examine various different relationships, one of which was they examined by male and female. And you can see actually there the red is the female users and the blue is the male users. And you can see that there is a gender difference in the routes that are chosen in California on that year. Now obviously you can't answer much from this in itself, and it would need further research to kind of delve into why there might be. But you can see how it could be used, by town planners, for example, to try and create spaces that would be encouraging for people to do physical exercise, as an example. I did have another example, but I'm not actually going to go through this one in the interest of time, and because it's talking about food and we're all getting hungry. So just to sum up very briefly, what we found from our review is that there were particular types of data were already being used and published of these repurposed data sources. So they included social media, as I showed you, smartphones and wearable technologies, retail data, transport, and geospatial, so things like Google Earth or Google Maps, which are used to kind of look at environment data. A lot of this research we found was pilots, so they were looking at the feasibility of these sources of data. A lot of them were descriptive. There were a couple, just a few, that were sort of what we'd call quasi-experimental, where they sort of assessed the impact of a policy, for example. But what they talked about was the potential benefits of using it. So it offers a breadth of scope which would be prohibitive, potentially, using our traditional funding and data collection designs, I guess. So that's a clear benefit already. Some forms of them are not reliant on self-report, so you could potentially get an objective measure, whatever that is. You can access populations who might be difficult to reach in terms of traditional recruitment, I guess. And you can evaluate real-world interventions where you don't have enough time to set up a beautifully designed RCT, or you don't have the opportunity. So there's a few being done at the minute on the sugar taxes. Boris Johnson will be pleased to hear. Of course, it's not perfect. So there are clear limitations. We have as I said, there's still a perception, and there's a real risk associated with sharing data like this. So there are ethical and legal questions about access and ownership. Commercial sensitivities, who owns the data and what they're going to charge us to use it. And then this one is key, really, questions about attributional adequacy. Can we really answer causal questions using this data? They tend to be monothematic, so although you get a lot of data, it's difficult sometimes to gather if what you've measured is actually a valid measure of what you're trying to measure. You get sampling bias, because of course MapMyFitness will only be used by people who have MapMyFitness, so you don't know what other people are doing. You don't use that. And then this one as well, which came up a lot in the literature, is the lack of control over data acquisition. It's messy, so you don't know which day you're going to get a seagull on your transport data that just messes up that day. So it can be very messy, so that's one of the challenges, is to try to come up with techniques to overcome some of those issues. So what's next? The ESRC network there's been talk about encouraging the use of repository centres in the hope that we could perhaps provide the skills, by we, I'm not actually involved in any of this, provide the skills necessary to help people with analysing it, but also to maybe protect the data so that there's some structures around safety, who accesses it, appropriate anonymity, etc. Those are a couple of centres that already are established. There's also other organisations doing things around trust, about working with the public about how they share their data, what it can be used for, as well as working with researchers about acknowledging that people have shared their data. And then on a personal note, I have just been working with Dan Martin. We're going to start a project with a Clue app, which tracks your menstrual cycle, as well as other behaviours like physical activity. So we are going to be looking at, from that app data, I think there's about 4 million users, to see what patterns in physical activity according to the menstrual cycle. And that is all I have time for. Please to know.